Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is His Worship the Mayor of Mosman Park, Mr. Norris. And it's like old homework, right? Mr. Norris is a qualified engineer for the past 40 years and has operated his own business as an insurance loss adjuster and risk management consultant. In the distant past, Ron and I spent many hours together in the City of Subiaco Council chambers when he was elected a councillor for the City of Subiaco in 1977. He served 2 terms, did not seek re-election, and moved to Mosman Park in 1983. In 1987, he was elected as a councillor in the town of Mosman Park until 2007, when he became the mayor. Mr. Ron Norris.
Thank you, Richard. For those of you who don't know, that's what the Robson report looks like. So if you happen to see it lost in any library, you most probably could rip it apart and bring us all a lot of pleasure. My contribution on the local government reform issue for tonight is to talk about the flawed process that we've been through in local government reform and to bring to your attention the order of magnitude of the money that's been wasted by the state government in this process since we started 3 years ago. We've had no guidance in the process. This has been a core problem for all local governments. The only response we've had from the state government has been bullying threats along the lines of, agree to amalgamate or we'll do it for you. And yet no evidence has been provided to demonstrate that this massive dislocation of local government is desired by ratepayers or that it will deliver any tangible benefit. Apart from Peppermint Grove, I'm not aware of one council which is opposed to the so-called reform process. All of us, including Peppermint Grove, willingly participated in the regional transition grouping process called the RTG process, not surprisingly, which Minister Castrilli initiated in February 2009. Similarly, we all made submissions to the Robson panel 12 months ago. Unfortunately, as far as the western suburbs were concerned, Mr. Robson wasn't listening. The Robson panel has now given the government its final report, and I'll come back to the content of that report later. But the government now expects us to make another submission on this report. To add insult to injury, they won't consider our submissions until after the state election in March. And we now learn that these submissions, unlike those that we made earlier, will not be published. We're told that publishing comments may prevent people from providing their true opinions. Of course. It also means that no one, except the government, will ever know what anyone thinks about the 30 Robson recommendations. I mentioned in passing that the only reason we have Robson's final report before us now is because the Premier was embarrassed into releasing it at the last WSA forum held in Cottesloe. Robson submitted his final report to the government in July, and I think the Minister was happily sitting on it, hoping we'd all forgotten about it. I suspect we would not have seen it until after the March election if the WSA forum hadn't occurred. It is unfortunate but not surprising that the government has refused to go to the election with a declared platform on amalgamations. The Local Government Association, WELGA, has tried to discuss aspects of the Robson report with the Premier, but he has refused unequivocally to meet. He will not discuss the reform agenda or local government issues with WELGA. Is this acceptable for an open and democratic society? As far as the cost of the exercise is concerned, in May this year, Minister Castrilli advised Parliament that since February 2009, the government has spent over $20 million on the local government reform process. Since then, Robson has completed his, and I say in inverted commas, independent review and reported to the government. I have to assume that this would have added another couple of $1 million to the bill. If the submissions from the councils on the final report are now to be considered by the local government department, if that ever occurs, that will bring us up to about $25 million. And if you now consider what the individual local authorities have spent responding first to the RTG process and then to Robson, draft and final, I suspect you could double that figure. What a monumental waste of time, money and resources. If the councils had been given some parameters such as target population, minimum rates turnover or land area for us to aim at, we may have been able to achieve something. Instead, we were given nothing. In May 2009, when questioned specifically on this point, Minister Castrilli's answer was, "You're all smart people, you can work it out for yourselves." To this day, we still don't know what the government wants to achieve by way of local government reform. The RTG process, which involved all West Australian councils, was almost a total failure. Subiaco and Netherlands explored the possibility of an amalgamation, but ultimately backed away. Geraldton and Greenock have amalgamated, but they have wanted to do that for years. It did not require the RTG process for that to occur. And I just mentioned in passing, you may have seen the recent publicity that the rates in the Geraldton-Greenock Shire have increased 24% in the last year. The RTG process did not give the government what it desired in the metropolitan area, so the next step was the appointment of the distinguished and independent Robson panel. The members of the panel may be distinguished in their respective fields of academia, but I can assure you they were not appointed for their knowledge of local government. And the panel's terms of reference ensured that they were not going to be too independent either. One of the terms was that they should identify new local government boundaries and a resultant reduction in the overall number of local governments to meet the needs of the community. Exactly what the needs of the community means has never been defined. So even if the panel, in its independent, and I say independent review, determined that no change was needed, a reduction in the number of councils always had to be recommended by Robson. We are now expected to respond to the 30 recommendations in the final report, which is a completely pointless exercise. I say pointless because if the government is re-elected and it has the numbers, the amalgamations will be rammed through, in the words of the Premier, by Act of Parliament, if necessary, regardless of what the councils or the communities want. Conversely, if the government isn't re-elected or it doesn't have the numbers, no change will occur at all. Either way, we have the very high probability that our submissions will never be acted upon. Even more unnecessary waste to be borne by the taxpayer. A core problem with the Robson Review is that it fails to consider the word local is relevant to local government. They don't see local government as communities, they see councils as corporations, as though the only issue being considered by residents is the cost of providing the services we provide, and Robson posits that this can only be achieved by creating larger municipalities. Robson imagines that the only outcome desired by ratepayers is fiscal astringency, yet the vast number of ratepayers and residents place far more value on connectedness and in the sense of community which smaller councils offer. As an aside, you may be aware of the recent dismissal of Canning Council. It is interesting to note that most of the councils which have been dismissed in the last 20 years have been large councils, exactly what Mr. Robson has recommended. The efforts of the panel could be viewed favourably if they were based on fact, yet they have recommended amalgamations in the face of the empirical evidence available from the eastern states which points in precisely the opposite direction. The Minister claimed cost savings of 10 to 15% could be achieved by amalgamations, yet the evidence in the eastern states is that costs have increased by that margin. At least Robson had the honesty to not agree with the Minister. You should appreciate that the Robson Review had nothing to do with beneficial fiscal outcomes. The sole purpose of the review is to reduce or eliminate effective local representation and to increase centralised power for the government, principally in relation to planning matters. To illustrate, a councillor in Mosman Park represents about 1,500 residents. If the Robson amalgamations occur, each councillor will represent 10 times that number. How a councillor could be expected to represent this number of residents on a part-time basis and with no administrative support is a mystery to me. Clearly, it is not the intention of the government that they will. I don't think the government could care less who was elected to a council. It merely wants the appearance of local democracy. Robson's recommendation 20 is that councillors serve a maximum of 3 terms and mayors 2 terms. The government doesn't want anyone on a council with the experience, skills or time to oppose its development plans. Recommendation 12 is relevant to this point. It proposes that the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, known as the MRA, be given control of airports, hospitals and universities. Giving controls of hospitals to the MRA would mean that a QE2 or a Fiona Stanley could pop up at the end of your street and there is nothing you can do about it. But the real objective of this recommendation 12 relates to universities. Mr. Robson was quoted at the start of his review process saying that one of the things he found frustrating about dealing with local government is that the University of WA, he had to deal with 3 separate councils. So you would not be surprised to see a recommendation like that pop up which says that if this were adopted, universities would be allowed to do whatever they wished with their land. And again, councils and communities would have no say in the matter. Recommendation 28 is that the government provide the tools to cope with the transition to larger councils. It is not recommended that the government fund the cost of this transition. This would indicate that the government is not only intending to do away with effective local government, but you will be given the pleasure of paying for it. I've deliberately selected only a few of Robson's recommendations to comment on, those recommendations which I believe have a direct and immediate adverse effect on our communities. We are faced with a sleight of hand position. The government either is too arrogant to understand it is accountable for this wastage and duplicity, or it thinks we are too stupid to do anything about it. The Western Suburbs Alliance is to be commended for allowing us to come together in forums such as tonight so that community outrage can be ventilated and shared. Thank you.